First, on BBC Wales, we join Cliff Morgan in conversation with Lord Parry of Neyland for this week's Time and Place.
It could be that people, I get a bit annoyed when I hear people saying that the Puritan represses his children or something. We had an immensely happy home, and it was extended and enriched by the presence of these people in their black suits, who turned out to be the most marvellous comedians and actors and raconteurs, as well as great preachers. And if we're missing anything perhaps in our Welsh life at this time, it's that dimension,
I often think, Lord Parry, that there's a time or a place that you say to yourself eventually, that was the most memorable and the most important time of my life.
I suppose that if I were to really rack my brain, I'd come up with Molliston and my father's leaving there. I remember standing looking into a wild rhubarb patch, and my cat Fluff was in there. And for some reason he didn't want to come to Neyland. He must have been badly informed about it. And I tried to get him out to take the milk and the pap, the bread and the sugar in the milk. Didn't want to come. And we left that cat in the rhubarb. And I think my innocence was really at an end that day, and I began to grow up. And that was the time and the place.
But you mentioned your father. What was he doing at Morris?
My father was a Radnorshire farm boy who came down off the hill and into the pit in Tredegar, and then got his way up out of the pit, as many of those lads did, as they sought education for themselves, and was eventually ordained as a Baptist minister in the oldest Baptist chapel in Pembrokeshire at Molliston. Across the river there, Cliff. You can almost see it from here.
What a lovely sight today, isn't it?
That's the River Cleddau.
Yeah. Great romance in this part of the world for you.
Tremendous. This is a magical, mystical county, Pembrokeshire, and that word Cleddau itself, the sword, carving into the heart of this county, and the sea drowning the river. It all impresses me immensely, and that's why Glenys and I are back here living now.
Obviously, this is why you took your title.
Yes, that was interesting. I don't know whether you know the traditions of the Baptist Church, do you? You're not far away from
I'm a yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, the independents were even more independent than the Baptists. My father was always known in the Baptist ministry, certainly towards the end of his life, which was a fairly long one, as Parry of Neyland. And when I had this astonishing, unexpected and in some ways ironic happening of being asked if I'd like to go into the House of Lords, and then having to face taking a title, in inverted commas, Parry of Neyland seemed pretty good to me.
Yes. Can I take you back, you see, because you mentioned your father and the Baptist chapel. How important was religion and a faith to you and all those around you in those days?
Oh, the whole thing. Molliston Baptist Chapel was an important crucible of what Pembrokeshire is. These Pembrokeshire people, are a unique breed. And much of it has been formed through the non-conformity, through the choosing to be different. And Molliston Baptist Chapel was very formative in that. 1667 and before that, people were choosing to follow the adult baptism, and my father came here as one of their leaders, but in a very, very long line.
You see, in the churchyard, 16 some odd it was, and I found it strange that they were burying people at 1624 there, whatever it was.
Well, even before that, there was a man who used to ride through the night. He'd be allowed out of prison in Haverfordwest and later in Carmarthen, and he'd ride through the night to hold communions at Rushacre near Molliston Chapel, in a barn there. And then the sad little things, because they couldn't have consecrated ground, because they weren't members of the established religion of the day, these babies would be buried, and there are actually marked stones on the walls of some of the gardens in Narberthon district where the early Baptists, the children of the early Baptists, were buried in the dead of night by the ministers of the then Baptist cause there.
Was it a logical step from the poverty of the pits, as it were, to the chapel for your father?
Totally logical, I think. He was, as I've already said, a farm boy. You can't really sustain a family as large as his parents' family became on the thin soil on the top of a Radnorshire hill. And they were all forced to go into Tredegar. And Tredegar was itself a boiling pot at that time. So much happening. And coal was at the heart of it all. And it was fairly logical then that the father and the 7 sons actually went down the pits. And my father, having grown up on those singing hills in Radnorshire, found himself in the clanging underground. And it wasn't congenial to him, I think, although he did have ambitions to be a mining engineer. And he was soon up on the hill again, you know, the little wooden hill in the chapels around the district, both in Eisteddfodwyr and also in the chapel services. And he went to Treville, which was itself a quarry village, a very famous one up above Tredegar, and there he met Samuel Evans, my grandfather, the president of the chapel there, and my mother. And of course, through meeting my mother and meeting them, he was drawn into that Baptist church. But in the meantime, he'd been affected by the 04 and 5 revival, you know, the famous revival that swept the valleys. And then, when he was older, he was able to go to Porth in the Rhondda, and he had a very lean time there, and my mother went back into service as a seamstress. She already had 3 children, although I wasn't born. And while she sewed to keep the family together, my father learned to preach and learned the rudiments of the Baptist faith from R.B. Jones and his faculty there in the schoolroom at the back of the chapel in the Rhondda.
I'm sorry to hear that he wasn't terribly comfortable in Porth, because that's where I come from, you see.
Well, in the history of the chapel at Molliston, you'll see that in 1923, as they say, a rather strange young man of whom no one knew much came from Anishere and took the services, and that was really our beginning here in Pembrokeshire. So that's the time and the place.
Was it a big leap for you to come down to this most glorious part of Wales, down to Pembrokeshire?
Well, I was actually born here, and that's my great
Oh, you
privilege.
were born
yes.
in
Over there, you know, behind Codcandas Woods. I've never moved more than 3 miles from either side of this river in one sense, although I've travelled, as you know, very extensively. But to come here at that time and to be born in the safe... My mother used to say, when we were at Molliston, she said, that's when we had least, but love, that's when we had most. Because this place did give us a security of background Molliston and then later Neyland. In a sense, I suppose, when we moved to Neyland, Neyland was the big leap, because Neyland was a railway town, as you know. And there were 350 fellows working at the Neyland railway yards. The chapel was a big one, the biggest my father ever had in all his ministry. And there again, I came under the influence of people. You see, the railway men were organised. They were in trades unions. The town had been given in 1900. The town had been given an urban council. So there was a great interest in social affairs here in the town.
Is that where your sort of passion for socialism and for the rights of the individual and for everything else that socialism means or should mean, is that where it started, with the railwaymen?
Not precisely with the railwaymen, although it was enriched by them and by their organisation and the fact that they got after me too. But more particularly, I say that my socialism came out of the social conscience that my father preached in his pulpit. He was not political. He didn't want to be involved with political parties, but he lambasted all and sundry on social issues. And I think it was a very natural thing to find myself part of the other side of the town when they began to talk about positive plans for putting a social conscience into action.
Now, you know, one thing that interests me deeply about walking around these parts in the last few hours or so, everyone says Lord Parry is all for the community which he wants to serve. And I stood in the rugby club, and there's a photograph of you with a rugby jersey on.
Absolutely.
As a player.
Yes, serving in that most distinguished of Welsh rugby teams, Neyland Seconds. The Neyland All Blacks took them all on at all levels.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
But, I mean, how important was rugby to you?
Oh, the whole thing. It's all the community, you see. Neyland is, I always describe it in Dylan's words, as a tumble-down town. It's as lovely ugly as Swansea was. And we grew up here knowing everyone and wandering these beaches and exploring the places. And then suddenly we were old enough to be playing rugby football. The war was over, the heroes were coming back. And there we were amongst them, playing rugby football.
It's a long, long way, of course, from Europe to Cardiff for internationals now. Were you angry or dismayed or sad about Swansea not having...
We didn't like it moving from St Helens at all, you know. No, there is this belief here in Neyland that for most people in official positions, nothing exists west of Swansea. And when they moved the rugby match away, I never dreamed that one day I would get a debenture in the national ground and quite like it.
Yeah.
I saw that famous last game. Do you remember that last game? With the
50, what it was, 4?
Yeah, there were a series of farewell games there. And in 1954,
That's right.
they had this marvellous game.
Against Scotland.
It was a game against Scotland,
Yeah,
and we
Jones.
saw a towering try scored there and attributed, I believe, to the wrong man, if I'm advised correctly.
What was that? Which try was that? Billy?
Well, it went to the wrong Williams. Stoker Williams should have had it, and I think they gave it to Rhys Williams, but your
quite right.
researchers will tell you that.
No, Billy always says that. You know, Billy Williams always says, I scored, he said. Yeah. And it was Ken Jones in a try as well, and he, that was the day he equalled Bancroft's record number of caps. So far we've mentioned the word 3 or 4 times, change. And most things have changed in this life. What's changed in this part of the world for you?
There's a very subtle change here, and a very dramatic one too. When we were growing up here, this area was one that depended very largely on the port. 1928 or thereabouts, 26, 28, the dockyard closed down, and that meant that one part of the port's association with the wider sea came to an end. And still for us, there was the romance of the fishing industry. The ice factory was at Barn Lake, which was a hangover from Neyland's earlier involvement with a fish market of its own. And one of the great joys for me used to be to go with David Day or Freddie Griffiths, whose fathers were involved in the trawlers, down to the Black Bridge on the railway and go aboard the trawler and travel down to Milford Haven. And it's rather amusing. I tell my fellow directors on Milford Docks board sometimes that I am the only one who ever entered Milford Docks from the sea on his first arrival.
Like an admiral.
I don't admit I was only 9 years of age at the time. But the whole of this basin then was still seeing its future wrapped up in the sea and in sea transport. And you know the history, how Shakespeare, you know, Cymbeline, the fairest port of all. Tell me how Wales was made so blessed as to inherit such a haven, and yet the haven, sadly, wasn't really developed. It didn't have the hinterland population. And then I was teaching, married, at home, living on the promenade at Neyland, and suddenly men in bowler hats came around buying land. And it was the beginning of the building here of a major European oil port. Possibly, you know, the largest single investment in the economy of Wales in the whole of its history. And yet it created an industry that lasted, between 21 and 25 years. We are now exporting through Milford Docks scrap metal, which is all that remains of the great Esso refinery, which was to herald a new future for the whole of this area.
You're always surrounded by friends, Gordon, aren't you? What?
Man's best friend, that. This is mine.
Yeah. What do you call him?
It's Gyp, Gypsy.
Do you find that you get comfort from having the old animals around?
Oh, absolutely. It's. I think if they're of your home, they've got to be in the home. No good keeping them in the backyard, is it?
Yeah. And of course, very little time you spent in your own backyard, really, because to describe you as peripatetic would be rather mean, wouldn't it? When were you sort of asked to become the chairman of the tourist board? Why?
Well, why is a big question. When is slightly easier. What happened was that when I'd fought my third election here in Pembrokeshire, and when that was over and I hadn't become the Member of Parliament for Pembrokeshire, they had a farewell. You know, it's a lovely, generous area, and I've got one or two particularly generous friends. And a man called Donald Seaton organised a collection, and to Glennis's astonishment and mine, we found that at the farewell party to my candidature, we were given return tickets. You know, politicians are usually given one-way tickets at the end of their career. We were given return tickets to Canada, and we saw that marvellous assembly, an international assembly. And I think the rumour went around the front bench in the House of Commons, you know, that it's better to lose an election in Pembrokeshire than to win it anywhere else. and because I was identified, I mean, it was it was an astonishing gift, a wonderful gift. And they identified me then as a traveller, you know. And the job was coming up as chairman of the Wales Tourist Board. And John Morris, who was then Secretary of State for Wales, he asked me if I would like to do it, and of course I was thrilled a bit.
You see, it's not easy for a Welshman, is it, to do this? Because someone said to me once, the Irish and the Welsh dislike two things in life, success and failure. Now, we've got North and South Wales, North and South Pembrokeshire, for goodness sake. We're split. Well, how do you manage to represent us all?
Well, that's part of the beauty, of course. I mean, anybody can be. I mean, if you live in a place called England, or in an ill-defined thing like the west of England, it doesn't set up much argument, does it? But if you're fortunate enough to live in a place like Pembrokeshire, well, you argue about which bit of Pembrokeshire you live in.
Yeah.
And it is true. The people, the ones who want to divide us, you know, they talk about the differences. Well, what is interesting, fascinating, is that this South Pembrokeshire bit, and I'm just across the river here on the wrong side, the South Pembrokeshire bit is fascinating in that the English language is as rich here as it was in Chaucerian England. And I could keep you going for ages with comparisons and words that come straight out of Chaucer, straight out of Shakespeare, straight out of Norman France. And exactly the same is true, my intellectual colleagues, the Welsh-speaking colleagues tell me, of the quality of the Welsh of North Pembrokeshire, individual, idiosyncratic, and yet part of Wales. And this is what Wales is about. It's about these differences, which don't divide us. I mean, the river divides us. The mountains in mid-Wales divide us a bit. But really, we are one people, and we have one language, which is Welsh, and we have another language, which is English, and one enriches the other. And that's what I have hoped to convey in my travels about the world. It is, of course, a bit of a shock for a Welshman, because it is, as you and I know better than most, a bit difficult to be humble about being a Welshman. It is a bit of a shock when a Welshman goes on his first overseas trip, and he goes to New York, and he sees all these things, you know, I love New York. And then somebody says, what part of England are you from? And he says, Wales. And it's difficult for the American to identify it. And if you saw the letters that I used to receive from the great and the good who went overseas and came back and said they didn't know anything about Wales. Now, it's not quite true, but there's not the sense of identity for Welshness about the world as there is for Irishness and for Scotsness. And I always took it to be my challenge to say to them, look, there is the best kept secret in European tourism, and it's called Wales. I let you in on the secret, now come and share it with me. And I think that's a selling point.
Yeah, I tell you what, do you remember faggots and peas at Brisbane at the Commonwealth Games? That was the great trip, and the Brisbane trip, the Commonwealth Games, wasn't it?
What about that moment when we were all sitting there on that stand and, you know, royal presences and everybody on their best behaviour, and suddenly Kirsty came out of the crowd in the race, do you remember?
Yes, to win.
And she won that magnificent race, and suddenly there was a Welsh choir in that whole oval there at Brisbane, and we were unidentifiable people.
Yeah.
It's the red of Wales and the blue of Scotland getting away from Heather Barrelett, and they've made their run for home, and it's a very strong run. Barrelett is third, Lorraine Baker, Shireen Hassan has got some running to do, another Australian girl in front of her, but Wales and Scotland doing battle at the moment. The Australian girl Barrelett pulling wide, and Clarkson going for the line. Kirsty McDermott holding her off. Kirsty McDermott of Wales is going exceptionally well. It's going to be Wales, Scotland, Australia, Australia, England and England, and Wales have come good again.
I was thinking, you know, a lot of people would say what a privilege it is to be in the House of Lords, and maybe a wrong privilege? Should the Lords exist?
Democratically indefensible, isn't it? And I had to wrestle, of course, when I received this strange invitation that one gets, but it's never an invitation until the moment it's too late for you to say no. I had to wrestle and have many times been asked whether I had, in fact, been a traitor to my earlier utterings as a socialist and as a member of the Labour Party. The fact is that though it is democratically indefensible, it is a part of the British Constitution. And no party can have pretensions to govern the country if it doesn't man the entire Constitution. Now, if it's removed and if it's no longer a part of the Constitution, different matter altogether. And so I was asked to go in. I asked if there was a job of work to do there, and I went. And of course, my life changed utterly and totally, because you don't become part of the parliament of your country, whether democratically elected or otherwise, without having your life change. And I found myself in a place that I'd only ever visited once, curiously enough. I found myself in there and being installed by that Gilbert and Sullivan ritual that we have, you know, where you stand up and with your hat on and you remove a hat, and I never ever wore a hat in my life except when I was at school. And you take your hat off 3 times, you bow to the Lord Chancellor. And the Lord Chancellor was that lovely man, that lovely Welshman that you interviewed in one of your earliest programmes. Lord Elwyn Jones.
Yes.
And he was sitting there, you know, he can have the look of an eagle or he can have the look of a dove. And in the early stages, he looked very much like an eagle to me, sitting up there, although I'd known him off and on over the years. And going through this ritual, I found myself moving up to where Lord Elwyn was sitting. And as I kneeled, I knelt in position there and handed him the writ summoning me. He said in his rich Llanelli Welsh accent, Llangyfarchiadau, and I said, Diolch yn fawr I chi. And there we had 2 West Wales Welshmen showing that Wales is very much united, even among those of us who don't have the Welsh as the first language. And I was a part then, from then on, of this chamber. And like everything else, Cliff, you know, it's like playing for Wales, I imagine, which I always wanted to do, and you did. The hardest job is getting in, isn't it? And once you're in and a member of the team, you find yourself meeting people who've been your idols all your life. And not only meeting them, but having their hand on your shoulder as a friend and as a mate. And then you realize that some of the artificial divisions that people so readily, you know, they wear placards around their neck, I am this and I am that, keep off. And how artificial those things are.
Wherever you go these days, people are always saying, what about the future? Are you optimistic or indeed pessimistic?
Cliff, I'm a natural optimist, although we Celts do have this deep vein of pessimism in all our thinking. I was encouraged a bit when I was in Hungary on a parliamentary delegation by a proverb that they have. They say the only difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that the pessimist is better informed. But a serious answer to a deeply serious question is this. I think that optimists are not quite as good as keeping their data banks up to date as the pessimists are. You know, they can always recite the figures of doom and gloom and misery. If really I had a platform that I could use, it would be to say that there has always been pessimism and we're still here. 1984 was George Orwell's year, it's over. 1985 is still full of optimism. The sun is shining. And my hael disclairio and our hour las. The sun is shining in a blue sky and we're here. And if we do it right, and if the children get the right messages from us, then there is a future. And that's how optimistic I am.